Okay, I guess we can get started now. Thank you all for joining us for the Back to the Office webinar on Nova Network November. We're so glad to have you, and I want to introduce our moderator and panelists. We have Bob Sansom, who will be moderating this program for us, and Liz Maughan, and Tyonne Hinson, and John Williams. My name is Priscilla Jackson, and I'm one of the I'm one of the assistant directors of industry and professional networks for the Alumni Relations Office. And I'm really glad to have everyone attending, and I hope you get a lot of insight out of this event. Please make sure to check out the survey that will come a day or so later. And as we always love to have your input. And without further ado, we are going to turn it over to Bob, and Bob will give you some information about himself, and so will the other panelists. Again, thank you.
Thank you, Priscilla. As you said, my name is Bob Sansone, and I graduated from Villanova in 1975 and had a 40-year career in human resource management. 17 of those years were with a multinational firm, and the last 23 years were with a software company, high tech, and with employees all over the country too. So I had exposure to different labor markets and different types of employees and different businesses throughout my career. And just when you thought you saw it all, something else came up. So it was an exciting run, and I learned a lot. And I missed the pandemic, but we're going to talk about its impact on the workforce and labor market tonight. So Liz?
Yeah, my name is Liz Maughan. I was class of 2010 from Villanova. I've been in the human capital HR space for coming up on a decade. Currently head of human resources and talent at a hedge fund here in Boston called Whale Rock. I was previously at another hedge fund in New York for just shy of 7 years. It's been nice being back in Boston, getting reconnected to my roots up here and getting reconnected to the Villanova alumni network up here. I'm excited to be part of the panel today.
Tyonne?
Thanks, Bob. Good evening, everyone. I'm Tyonne Hinson. I am Villanova Master's Class of Nursing 2001. And I have been in the healthcare industry for over 25 years. I've been a nurse, actually a pediatric maternal child nurse focused in the areas of neonatal intensive care, fetal, and more recently pursued a doctorate of global public health back in 2013. And so that trajectory has landed me in healthcare leadership, particularly in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I serve as the Senior Vice President and Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at Baystate Health, where I've been about the past year, but previously before that served at both Boston Children's and Children's Hospital Philadelphia. So it's definitely good to be here as well.
John?
Thank you, Bob. And hi, everyone. My name is John Williams. I'm from Madison, New Jersey. I'm a 2003 graduate from the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences with a degree in economics and a minor in philosophy. I also played soccer for Villanova too. And I'm currently the president-elect of the Villanova Alumni Association. So events like today are really important to me and I think to our community, because this is really the power of what Villanova is our Nova network, where we're able to collaborate together, meet each other, and innovate together and advance our careers. So tonight's really an exciting night. So I encourage everyone to participate tonight, as well as participate within your local clubs, with your local club networking events, also game watches, philanthropic events. It's really a great opportunity to meet and get to know people and ultimately have a great network within the Villanova community. Just a little bit about myself. Once I graduated from Villanova, I was in the construction field for about 3 years. Thereafter, I transitioned into the corporate real estate arena I've been doing that for the past 18 years for a company called CBRE.
Okay, thanks, John. Okay, so now that we've had a chance to meet the panelists, let's get started. So in the last 20 years, the issue of working from home was starting to emerge. And as companies, technology improved and employees were asking about it, and in some cases getting it and others not. And then the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden it became a necessity, and we were into it. And now the pandemic's over, and everybody's kind of looking around and trying to figure out how to get everybody back in the office. And so we're really not sure how it's going to shake out. I don't know that it'll ever go back to 100% at home or 100% in the office. And I think time will tell how that'll shake out. So I wanted to start with a broad question, just to get a feel for the perspectives of the two groups, the employers and the employees. So the first question is, what are the major benefits to an employer for having employees work from home? And then part B of that will be conversely, what are the drawbacks or the downsides? So Liz, would you like to go first on this one?
Yeah, happy to. I think, like, to start from an employer perspective, I think truly like a huge piece of it is ultimately like employee satisfaction, retention, and being able to attract talent, like a broad range of talent, in offering the flexibility to work remotely. I think it's something that many employees have said they want and they value. And so I think allowing that employees feel respected and heard in many ways. I think the employees, even pre-pandemic, who had the ability to work from home, really appreciated it, and so many of them didn't abuse it, and I think tend to work pretty hard when they're home. I also think there's a significant benefit from what I've seen from a diversity perspective, both in terms of fully remote talent, where you can access talent that otherwise would not be able to work for your company if you're allowing someone to work fully remote and can have access to talent across the entire world. That also allows companies in many ways to hire, if you're in a more expensive place to live, hire employees in less expensive areas, ultimately like a cost savings for the company. And I think for employees who need some level of flexibility in that same DE&I angle, allowing employees who are caregivers, either for kids or for adults, or who have like commitments or passions outside of work, giving employees that flexibility to be there to do that is a pretty significant benefit. Downsides, I think there are also some challenges that come along with that from an employer perspective. I think about even from the early days of the pandemic, all of the conversation around how do we do this? How do we manage employees remotely? While I think we've gotten a lot better in many ways, there are still some challenges with that. I think it is a little more challenging, and it's just not something we're as used to manage a remote workforce. And I think that just takes a lot more effort in many ways from managers and from the employer. And two other challenges, I think, from a cultural perspective, something that we're all still trying to figure out is how to sort of foster and maintain a culture when it's either a fully remote workforce or a hybrid workforce, and making sure there's enough like sticking power and glue to hold everyone together. And lastly, I think from a training and development standpoint, I think it's something that's different. I don't know if like long-term it's more of a downside, but I think it's still pretty new to onboard, to train, to develop employees remotely. And so that's something we're all still figuring out. Did you want me to dive into the employee side of things too?
No, not yet. We'll stick with the employer. So Tyonne, would you like to say anything?
I think she did a really great job in really going through all of them. I'm happy to talk a little bit from the employee perspective, if that would be helpful.
Well, could you hold off on that?
Sure.
Okay. Uh,
I guess from the employer, I just would just continue then to share, for me, emphasis around the geographic diversity. And I don't want to recap everything previously shared by Liz, but I also think flexibility is a huge component of that. And from a perspective of being able to utilize and be productive in all of the time that is actually available in your day. So instead of spending that time in commute or really being in those places of transition, many argue that you maybe get a few more hours of productivity from that perspective of the employee. And really making that case. From the downsides, just really quickly, I echo again what Liz shared about development, really those pieces around deeper relationship building, when you have those pieces of having your colleagues in the office and really thinking about also your own personal development, and also really, I think, building that credibility in some ways that sometimes as an employee, having that face-to-face with your leader at times or those around you can be very different sitting around the table versus maybe across a technology platform or other pieces. And I would just say the important pieces of also balance. Sometimes from an employee perspective, the one piece is having that cut from work and life. And I think that sometimes working from remotely, that really can potentially bleed in if there are not strong boundaries. So like I said, I agree with everything Liz said, but just wanted to echo those few sentiments.
okay, thank you. John, would you like to chime in?
Sure. So just to echo what both Liz and Tyonne said is that the pandemic has taught us that people want flexibility. It's companies are willing to provide that flexibility just as long as the productivity is there. So I like to say that you have to create a place where people want to be, not a place where people need to be, which is really where they want to be. So that's where this flexibility comes in. And will it be 100% remote, 100% in office? I don't think we will know yet. I don't think we will know until we have a full labor recession. We're still dealing with historically low unemployment rates. If the unemployment rate changes even to what happened back in 08 or 09, we were significant to a 10% unemployment rate, things may change. So once we go through a full labor cycle, I think we'll figure out where we land on remote, hybrid, or in office. But the positive of having this hybrid or remote environment is the flexibility. I think the negative is on the learning aspect. A lot of the studies have shown in school-age children that they have erased over 2 decades of progress in both reading and math. Studies haven't been assembled yet for the workplace, but I would imagine that the studies are pretty similar to that. And even from a DE&I perspective, minority students have had the most significant drop in test scores during the pandemic when people were learning remotely. I would imagine that's probably pretty similar in the workplace as well. So I think this is very nuanced right now. And I think we really have to focus on the learning and apprenticeship type aspect of this, because I couldn't imagine coming into the workplace right now, graduating Villanova and being at home. I think for all 4 of us, that's a pretty big challenge. The way we've learned in our careers is through that apprenticeship type model and those relationships that we build.
Okay, thanks, John. So I'll chime in a little bit too. I would echo what all of you said. I do have a couple of things to add. From the benefit to the employer, it may not have surfaced yet, but it will at some point soon as leases come up. There are a lot of companies that have a lot more space than they need, And when they downsize their space to fit the number of people at work, there would be a lot of savings. That's not going to be great for the commercial real estate market, but if things, if we have half the people working home and you only need half the space, that's going to be something that in the short term at least would benefit the employers. And we don't know which way that's going to go in the long run, but I would expect that pretty soon we're going to start seeing companies' leases expire and then taking back half the space. On the downside to the company, I think the issue is corporate culture. That if you have a good culture, that is, and I know the high tech company that I work for had a great culture, and it was passed on. And managers were all promoted from within 99% of the time, and so we knew if they fit the culture, and they did, and they fit in really quickly, and we had low turnover for the industry, and the concern that I would have is if people aren't face to face as much, will the culture survive or will it change? And so I think that could be a downside for any company that has a culture that they're proud of and promote. And certainly we had that. So I think those are two things that nobody else brought up that come to mind for me when I think about the employer. Does anybody want to add anything before we go on to the employee? Okay, so same question for the employee. What's the biggest benefit to being able to work from home? And conversely, what is the greatest negative consequence potentially? So let's do it in the opposite direction we just did. John, you go first this time.
I'm sorry, Bob, can you repeat the question?
Sure. It's from the employee's perspective. What's the greatest benefit to them for working at home, and what is the greatest possible negative consequence?
So from an employee standpoint, go back to, I would have a probably pretty similar answer than I did before, is that, for an employee, you get the flexibility. I think being able to see your family more often now certainly is a significant benefit to all of us. And I think that has been a significant impact. And then, part of the challenge is that, I think a lot of our health and wellness has been challenged by not being in person more. Studies also have shown that being in person helps us feel and think better. So I would imagine that as we continue to come through the remnants of COVID, that people are going to still want to be in person. So I think the hybrid model is probably here to stay for the foreseeable future.
All right, thanks. Tyonne?
Yes, so from the employee perspective, and I'm really speaking, I think, from again, John highlighting hybrid piece, there are, I think, many pros related to really allowing for that balance. The need to learn how to be nimble in the current time for companies and organizations has allowed employees to also learn new ways of work and supporting an organization. And so when I think about that from my industry of healthcare, there is that greater flexibility given because there are ways to have clinical productivity from home and having telemed visits. And so it's learning for some new skills, it's new development, but it's also enhancing the professional aspects of potentially what you always did in office and being able now to use your skill set to do it remotely. At the same time, for the company, it's impacting as we see patient visits and revenue and all those important pieces that you talked about. I would say that from the downside, one of the things for employees is if you do not have that access to the technology, the broadband, that is something very significant, because it does create a situation where there may be equity challenges in certain communities, with many things becoming technology dependent or technology driven in a hybrid or virtual model. So that is something that I think not only do we have to think about from, I know in our scenario of healthcare, of thinking going to virtual for both our employees and that of our patients. And if we are thinking about that for our employees, it's helping support our employees around access for those pieces. So that's something really big that I would want to lift up for employees around access across all communities.
Thank you. Liz?
Yeah, I feel like John and Tyonne hit a lot of it. I guess what I would add to that, when I think about ability to work remotely, and what people are really productive with, it's some of that focus time. So I think it depends on the individual. But, I think one of the benefits to that is sort of getting to manage what you do in the office and what you do remotely, and that there are a lot of distractions both places, certainly. But, I think when you're home and you have that focus time, you're not having someone pop into your office or sitting at an open floor plan and having constant distraction. So that can be a pretty significant benefit that I hear a fair amount. And then sort of going back to that geographical diversity from the employer side, on the flip side, being able to work for employers that you otherwise wouldn't be able to work for, or live where you want to live, I think is a pretty significant benefit. A lot of that is assuming like a fully remote job, which isn't always the case, but a potential benefit. And then on the downsides, I think John and Tyonne hit a lot of it. I think the culture piece, missing some of that bonding. And I feel like that's what we're hearing from a lot of the more recent graduates is, in contrast to what some people are saying, or what we hear anecdotally a lot, that the younger generations just want to be remote. I think a lot of it is they want to come into the office for that socialization piece, not necessarily the training and development that we're all talking about, but truly just having like peers and colleagues that they can talk to. So I think that's a bit of a bummer sometimes, when people are remote. Yeah, and then I think John had said this too. I think so much of my early career was learning through osmosis and just hearing the conversations around me, getting pulled into conversations that I otherwise might not be in. When you're remote, that just doesn't happen. You don't get that learning through osmosis, and it's different for different roles, but if you're in a position or in a company where there is that apprenticeship model, for many people, there's a lot of value to that.
Bob, I just was going to jump into something Liz said, and
Sure.
I read a recent Forbes article, and literally the top 3 things that she mentioned were really the workplace conversation, missed lunches with your colleagues, and those after-hour events, and really just regular daily structure. So all of those things are really big, and I think a big part also generationally of what we're seeing. So.
And that's a good point with the generational side of it. People's opinions on where they want to be is all generational, and also is on where you are in your life. So I have young kids, so it's tough for me to work at home because it's, with them running around the house and so on and so forth. But someone that maybe in the later stages of their careers and they don't have that at that point, they can be home. They've already been through the full office experience. So they may want their last 5 years just to kind of finish that at home. On the flip side of this, which is very interesting right now, is we have Gen Z now starting to come into the workplace. And keep in mind that Gen Z is the generation that saw COVID firsthand, where they got locked down at Villanova. They did not have a high school graduation. They didn't get to experience what we got to experience. And the early studies that are coming out are showing that Gen Z does want to come back to the office, where kind of millennial wants to be more home. So it's going to be very interesting to see over the next few years how that generational aspect of the workplace is going to either continue or change.
Great, thanks. I'll just add a couple of comments because I think you hit most of them very well, almost. But I would echo the comments on the flexibility as far as the benefits, and I think you've all elaborated on that. And I'll chime in on the downside. You know, the osmosis is just hard to replace. I think any employee in the beginning of their career just benefits tremendously from being in a conversation they wouldn't otherwise be in, even if they don't say anything, or being able to ask questions in those conversations as well. And I think that's priceless. And so I'm not sure how being remote can replace that. And it's going to be a challenge for someone to figure out. Another downside I would see is for newer employees, I think it's tougher. I think if someone's been working in a company for 5 years, they know everybody, they know where to get answers, and they have relationships with people. A new employee takes longer to get up to speed, I think, in that. And I don't know how long it would take. I know my son switched jobs in the pandemic, and he said it was a little awkward. I mean, he was welcomed, but I guess he felt like he was new for a lot longer. I remember, that feeling when you don't feel new anymore, when you're in a new company. And I think that's a longer period. And then the last thing I would say is there is the possibility that an employee, a lot of people who want to work remote have a job that can be done just as well remotely. We had a lot of technical people who did things, developers, people who moved data around, people who did customer support and things like that. And if that's what they want to do, they could do it for a long, long time and be very, very good at it. But sometimes you might miss out on an opportunity because you weren't in the office and people don't know you as well. Or they may want you to be in the office. It might be a management position or something. And they may say that has to be in the office. And so you could miss out either by not getting the opportunity or getting the opportunity, but not having the in-depth relationship that you would have had if you were in the office. So those are harder to quantify, but I do think that could be a reality as well.
And Bob, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there. I think it's a conversation of a job versus a career. So we've talked about this where, if you have a job, that certainly could be done in a mostly remote capacity. But if you have a career, you have to build those relationships. You have to continue learning. So that's where having a more hybrid or in-office experience is important.
Absolutely. Okay, so I guess one question I've got is the answers that we're giving today. Do you think in 3 or 4 years we'll be asking the same questions, or do you feel like practice makes perfect, and as the more experience we get with this, the better we'll get at it?
So I'm happy to chime in. I would say that, as stated earlier in all of the literature that I'm reading, we know that this is likely here to stay. We've shown from a perspective, as I think when we had to step up to move productivity to a remote or virtual space, that happened for many organizations. And in some instances, such as healthcare and other places, things that were said couldn't happen pretty quickly, like within days and hours, right? So there are going to be individuals, as John stated, that are in different spaces and places in their careers. And we're also going to have different needs based on generations and what maybe your personal life requires. What I do think is that we'll learn more about in industry, how our individual industries, our roles, and those aspects can be developed and morphed. For instance, in healthcare, and a space that has always, or in many places where I've been more remote, has been informatics and technology. And people have been able to do that from anywhere across the nation. Nursing and being a provider, on the other hand, there is definitely a need in some space to have someone that is there to provide the human touch and the art of treatment and healing and care. So I believe that there will always be a space to identify maybe what those pieces are. And I also think that there is not a ample substitute for human interaction. And so I do believe that even if organizations have a primarily remote or virtual situation, you will find that there are probably bi-yearly retreats or something to bring the teams together, because that human connection, those pieces of really getting to know each other and build those relationships and that camaraderie, I think is a huge part of productivity, building your diversity of thought and thinking and being together. So those are my thoughts about that.
Thank you. Liz?
Yeah, I think it's such a good question. I feel like a couple of years ago, if you asked me, I would have been like, oh, surely this conversation will end soon. And here we are 3.5 years later, still talking about the future of work. I think, we're all going to figure it out a little bit more, both from the employer side and employees. Like, I think, as John said, like, it depends on where you are in your life, what you want. And I think we'll all sort of get better at figuring out like what we're good at, what we want. Like, that's going to change throughout our lives. And I think companies will sort of iron out their employer value proposition and, what's most important to them. And again, same thing, that might change over the years. But I would imagine that, like, we all know remote work isn't going away, accepting that this is like the new reality, and embracing it, like embracing the benefits, figuring out how to mitigate some of those risks and challenges. I think from both sides, like, there will be a little more clarity, would be my hope and my guess over the coming years.
John?
I personally don't think we will know in 3 to 4 years. As I had mentioned earlier, I still think we need to go through a full labor recession. We haven't gone through that yet. It's really right now, because the unemployment rate is so low, we have a battle between the employer and the employee, right? So my firm has done a lot of studies in this. We've gone out to the top 300 companies in the world and asked for feedback on that. And the interesting thing is, the executives of a firm don't think their employees are as productive in the office. Of course, the employee thinks they're more productive at home. So you have this constant battle going back and forth. And I think it's much in the way the business world is. It's supply and demand. Right now, there's a lot of demand for employees, so the employees have the leverage. If that switches, I think employers are going to probably pull that leash back a bit. And the other interesting thing that Tyonne said, we started talking about how people adjusted pretty quickly when COVID happened. The interesting thing is, remote work, it was pretty seamless, right? And we went home and productivity actually increased. But by human nature, when we are in a scenario with uncertainty, we buckle down. So productivity, as tracked by Google, went up about 38% in the first 6 months. Thereafter, their productivity went down by 12% from pre-pandemic levels. So that turns into the burnout. And I think that's a lot of the mental health issues that we're facing today, is that people are getting burned out with that always on mentality. I can tell you now, it's, not only do you get emails at all hours of the night, if people can't reach you with an email within 2 hours, you get a text message. That stuff is not sustainable, in my opinion. I think there has to be boundaries. So I think it's going to be this constant push. And I think we're still going to fight this battle for a few years to come.
good point. Yeah, one of the things you said, and I'm trying to remember which one it was critical, and I can't remember the point, so I won't comment on it. So I think maybe somebody mentioned before the hybrid model and some of the other things. Could we talk a little bit about what your companies are doing, with bringing people back in the office, or how they're handling it, what approach they're taking, and whether or not you feel it's effective, and if it's been accepted by the employees or if it's part of a transition. So Liz, why don't you go first on this one?
Yeah, so we're a fairly small firm. We're 30 people, mostly here in Boston. We fairly quickly pivoted back to in-office shortly after the vaccines rolled out, and have been in on a 4-in-1 schedule with flexibility. So that oftentimes ends up being a little closer to 3-2. It's admittedly been hard to get to that full 4 days. I think there's at least one extra day every week where you have some sort of commitment outside of work, a doctor's appointment, some sort of reason to add an extra day home. We have a beautiful office, so many perks. We have a fair amount of events, like all of these draws that make it like a nice place to be during the day, not to mention a great culture. And people like being around each other. I think 3 feels like enough for a lot of people. In the sort of broader asset management industry, obviously there's a pretty wide spectrum. Some firms are much more remote heavy, and some firms are back to 5 days in the office. I feel like the trend over the past couple of months, and looking ahead to beginning of 2024, a lot more firms are getting closer from that 3-2 to the 4-1. So it does feel like that conversation is continuing to change.
Is that a Boston thing? I mean, because I've heard that from some other people down there too.
I maybe a little bit, but it's sort of funny. One of the HR channels that I'm a part of is probably 300 plus firms nationally, and that was a conversation just today. Was what are people doing? Has it been changing? And there's been a fair amount of conversation around that changing fairly recently.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Tyonne.
So I have had the privilege of working into pretty sizable organizations over the pandemic. I started off in Boston and am now in the western side of the state. What I will say is that it was a tremendously fast pivot when I was in Boston in the beginning of the pandemic. I felt like the city pretty much shut down, and that was from an organizational perspective of hospitals as well. Unless you were a direct caregiver, it was very much, Friday, March 13th, get your laptop. We're having an all hands on deck meeting, and everybody sort of moved out. And even up until, really not having a lot of ask in the sense of coming back into the office full time from a perspective of if you were not a direct care provider or in direct care provision at that time. I think really thinking about how we could support the employee as well as the benefit, as John identified, of we have a lot of space that maybe was hoteling or other maybe real estate that was no longer needed because a lot of operations could be moved to remote and had been successful. I'm now in a different type of position that is a senior leadership position, and the experience I believe here was senior leaders were in the office the entire time. We're in pretty standard. And I would say that we are contending with the realities, however, of having healthcare providers, even though they need to have direct human interaction. How can we offer that additional flexibility? So from a nursing perspective, again, as there is a demand on nursing resources, and salaries and all those pieces, how can we be more flexible? How can we look at the wages? How can we look at any piece of just incentivizing? And a huge part of that is about time, less about, I think, with, as we highlighted our generational differences, we're finding now it's important to employees of certain generations about time away from work, not working to live, but literally, not living to work, but working to live, right? So the time off is more important than spending time, in the clinical bedside or doing the other work. So it's definitely learning to pivot, and the flexibility is really, really important, and being able to offer remote and different opportunities clinically. There's a lot of remote opportunities around behavioral health and providing scribe work and other pieces. So you're finding a lot of innovation in the space.
Great. So, John, can I jump ahead of you?
Of course.
I partly because I remembered the point I thought that you hit the spot on, which is part of the answer here. And it was about we haven't had a downturn in the labor market, and that really will tell the tale in the future. But I talked to my company last week just to see what they were doing, and they're doing a 3-step approach. It's either 100% in the office, 100% remote, or 3 days in the office and 2 at home. And the most of the ones that are 100% remote are the ones that are either geographic or because of the job. So, they were working, they might have been working remote before, and so they're still working remote. And then, believe it or not, there are some people that like to be in the office. So there are some people that have said, I want to get away from the kids or whatever, but I'm coming in the office every day. And I might even work late too. But and then the ones in the middle, I think kind of like the flexibility to be able to work from home 2 days. And I'm sure it's not so rigid that if you wanted to come in on a Monday instead of taking Monday off, they wouldn't say no. So it's, and I think a lot of it in the high tech world is fear of the employees just walking because they're in such demand, they can get jobs very easily. And so I think, because I ran into the chairman of the company a little while ago, and he told me that they were kind of behind the industry by doing this hybrid, the 3 options, with the middle one being the hybrid. And I think that's a lot of it, because especially in some of the markets that we're in, it's just cutthroat, and the employees don't have to complain about their manager or their job; they just go get another one. So we haven't. It's been a long time too, so I don't know if we're due for one, but it kind of, I guess, forces you to be more flexible as an employer, because you've got that piece to balance.
And,
So, John?
and to take it to how many days a week, what we were discussing too was we're seeing mostly either in office now or mostly remote. So I think to Liz's point, that 4 and 1 or 3 and 2, but that's certainly important. But in my opinion, the most important part of that is being together all at once. If someone comes in on a Friday and they're there by themselves, it's really not a productive use of that person's time. It's really important that everyone is there, so everyone can learn from each other, can collaborate. So, I like to say it's a choice with conditions, right? So, some companies have been doing 2 or 3 days in the office, or 2 to 3 days. You got to be on these certain days with a 1 floating day. But I think the key component is really, if people are in, you should be in, because I think that's helpful for that mentorship, learning, and building those relationships too.
Yeah, and to your point, I have found that probably for those spaces that are hybrid and maybe don't have everyone in every day, the daily huddle. So a time where everybody is on together to really talk about what are those pieces that need to be elevated so everyone is raising or has the ability to raise concern or bring up those pieces across the team. So that has been something that if people did not have uniformly, I found that in different industries, even we used to do it. I mean, we've done it for quite some time in healthcare, but I'm finding when I talk to others in their industries, they're also instituting more of those opportunities for a common touch base if you're not seeing each other every day in the office. So.
Okay, we've got a little bit of time left. I think we're supposed to start wrapping up a little bit. And rather than asking a question, I guess, well, maybe the question I'll ask is if you would like to make some closing comments, and maybe if there's something that you wanted to talk about that hasn't come up, or something you wanted to say, or something that just struck you tonight, if you would like to just take a few minutes and talk about that, and then we'll wrap it up. So, John, would you like to go first?
Sure. So I think it's the diversity of thought. It's nice to hear everyone's experience so far. I think, the one thing that's certain is that the future is unknown. So I think we'll all figure out where this eventually lands. We could still be talking about it for 3, 4, 5 years down the road at Nova Network November. So, I think the real important thing is having those relationships and having organizations such as the Nova Network where we can bounce ideas off each other and collaborate. So that's the thing I've always leaned on and learned. And, it's no different than tonight that you hear such great opinions and trends and learn from every experience.
Okay, Liz?
Yeah, this was a helpful conversation for me. I feel like a few good takeaways here, personally too. I think it's helpful that like we all continue to think about this and talk about this. Agree, John, we don't know what the future is going to hold. And I think it'll be interesting to see, the development for people individually and for companies, figuring out like what the right sort of fit is at any given time. And I think the creativity here, Tyonne, you talked a fair amount about this. Creativity, like from the employer side, how can we listen to employees? How can we listen to others to sort of help people feel heard, give people what they want, help with that equity piece. I feel like that's a big takeaway for me tonight.
I would say that my largest takeaway and what I want to leave is this is yet again another example of being able sometimes to do what we thought wasn't possible. So in my industry and many other industries, we had to pivot in record time and really determine how to safely care for our employees as much as our patients and our organization, without letting operations fall. And that was done by many diversity of thought, with bringing everyone together and really thinking about that. Sometimes it happened in the office, sometimes it happened virtually. And I think what this shows us is that we are able to accomplish the operations and what we need to in both settings. I think, as John highlighted, there are many pieces of learning from our research around productivity, wellness, the needs not only of generations, but also of individuals based on maybe what they need from an inclusive perspective, and also generationally, and really taking those into consideration. So if anything, I think that this has been a tremendous learning, not just around this piece for the pandemic, but also in future things that we will confront, and recognizing that we were able to and have been able to work through this and find some semblance of opportunity for all communities, whether it's in office, virtual, or hybrid, and that we'll be able to use some of these learnings forward in other challenges that we face moving forward.
Thanks. I have some interesting takeaways too. I feel better listening to all of you because I retired just before the pandemic. And I remember telling people I got out just in time because I really didn't want to have to deal with that. But it's amazing how people and companies adapt and figure out ways to solve problems. And I used to think about what would have happened if this happened 20 years ago, and when it wasn't so easy to get people connected at home. Because I think after 9/11, we were everybody was scrambling to put together disaster recovery programs so that if something happened, they could get work done from home. And that was, I think, really the beginning of companies getting the technology in place and then seeing that it worked and fixing it when it didn't work right or whatever. So maybe the one thing that was fortunate about the pandemic is that it happened when it happened and not 20 years earlier. Because, I mean, it was, in some companies, it was seamless. I know in my company, they had everything all set up and people had the laptops that, you know, they could connect into work and would have been a lot harder 20 years earlier. So, and I think everybody's adapting too to, you know, doing more FaceTime stuff and not being in person. And so I feel good about it. I feel better about it. And I do think the flexibility is great. I kind of wish I had some of that.
And hello again.
Hi, Casella.
We have a few questions. I know, John, did you get to go?
Yes, I
before
did.
Okay, so we have a few questions, and if you don't mind, I'd like to read them to you and let the panel answer them. So the first one says, all of the benefits of being in the office is geared towards extroverts. No contemplation is given towards introverts, people with anxiety, neurodivergent people, or people with other non-obvious mental issues. Can someone discuss that or opine on that?
I'll speak to it. I'm an introvert, so so I understand the issue, and that's one of the concerns that I had initially, where you have to make an effort to get involved and speak up, and you know, it doesn't mean that you're not following things. It's just that you're thinking inside instead of outside. So I think for people who, you know, go beyond introvert, perhaps people who have some anxiety issues, have a tougher task in this kind of a environment, and hopefully they have a mentor or someone they can confide in at work who can offer some help. And you know, mentors could be another casualty of this because I had mentors all through my career in different places, and they were quite valuable. So I guess my advice would be to someone who's in that position would be to, if they have a mentor, to find, you know, to talk to them and see if they can get some help, because they can usually open some doors.
I will also chime in from a perspective of inclusivity and equity. This is a space that I believe has not been given as much attention over the years as we think about inclusivity of communities, and it's very much a topic that is definitely around neurodivergence and other pieces around anxiety and some of those pieces that have been stigmatized. And so I believe a lot of focus is now on this and should be not only related to being in the office, but also when we have our employees working in virtual settings, because you have also the need for support. And so I do, to Bob's point, really have encouraged individuals to reach out to their wellness if they have wellness opportunities or coaches within their organization, but also to all of you who are leaders in your organization, just encourage that if you do not hear inclusive discussions happening around these aspects of inclusivity or equity, that you do elevate them in your organization, because it's very real. And I appreciate you raising this topic for discussion.
And we have one other question, and it says, they write, shouldn't employers learn to be more creative when it comes to training, coaching, and promoting employees? Old models of work die out for a reason. And I think this is in reference to the discussion about training when you're virtual, especially during the pandemic.
I think that's spot on. I think that, when we talk about like what's going to change, is this conversation, like, are these challenges that we started the conversation with still going to be the challenges that we're talking about in the coming years? And I think that's where employers are going to get better at managing a remote workforce, at coaching, promoting, onboarding. I think we're being forced to do it. And I think that means that employers will get better, and that probably some of these like older ways of thinking will die out or will shift and change.
Well, that is the end of our questions. Did we have any other last thoughts, or we done? Well, I just want to thank everyone again for attending. This webinar was recorded, so you all that registered will receive a copy. And I look forward to seeing more people at the additional Nova Network November programs. Thank you very much. And thank you to our panelists and moderator. You all were great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.